All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get started here. My name's Nick Jarvis. I am the Chief Operating Officer with the League. I'm here to talk to you today about transparency. Transparency in concept, some of the applicable laws that affect transparency in the state. I'm going to give you an example that some of you are probably very familiar with of our own organization. We are a governmental entity and we are required to comply with transparency laws. We were not doing that for a very long time, so I'll walk you through kind of how we got back on board. And then I also want to hear from some of you as far as some horror stories you may have had or some best practices that you'd like to share. So let's get going. So like I said, I initially want to talk to you about transparency just as a concept. And there are particular and explicit laws and certain things you can and cannot do. But overall, the trend of transparency, of more open government, more transparent government, more access to government is a trend that we see no signs of slowing. It's something that I'm sure you all deal with on a daily basis and something you'll continue to deal with going forward. I want to talk about where it begins, where does it go from there, and where does it end, if ever. We're going to talk about the Open and Public Meetings Act. We're going to talk about the Government Records Access and Management Act, commonly known as GRAMA. The Transparency in Government Act, which requires you to do financial reporting. We'll also talk to you about the Office of the State Auditor, who is typically the enforcement mechanism for most of these laws. We'll talk about technology and how it affects transparency. And then, like I said, we'll go into ULCT's survivor story. And as you're listening to this presentation, please think about some of the examples that you have in your own organizations related to transparency. Now, we've all heard the phrase, light is the best disinfectant. People have always accused any organization that operates completely behind closed doors of being corrupt, of having something to hide. Government, we have to be open. We're doing the public's business, so it has to be done publicly. It's more than just saying we've got nothing to hide, though. It's about encouraging your citizens to be more engaged. There's having them more informed, which makes them better citizens and ultimately your city to run better. And it's just become an expectation of democracy. A monarch would not really have to tell you why or what they were doing. It would just be done. They would order by edict, rather by legislation. So in a democratic society, we expect to be engaged in an open and transparent process and to have a say in that. The more and more we rely on technology and the better technology gets, the more it becomes an expectation of your citizens to have things not just being able to access them like you can through GRAMA through a specific request, but just being able to go to your website and finding things like that. And it also increases the trust and participation that you have with your citizens. The more they believe what you're doing is in the public interest and that they can see that clear and plainly, the more they want to participate in the process as well, and the more they trust the elected officials when they make those hard decisions. What law initiated the first modern transparency requirements in the state of Utah? We've got the Open and Public Meetings Act, GRAMA, GRAMPA, and the Transparency in Government Act. But I'll go ahead and let you know it is the Open and Public Meetings Act. So the Open and Public Meetings Act, it forces government entities to hold open and public meetings. Like I said, you're doing the public's business, so it has to be done in public. Not only do you have to have that open, you have to, there are certain notice requirements so that people actually know you're going to meet. You can't just have an impromptu meeting where you decide and say after the fact, oh yeah, it was open, people are allowed to attend. You have to make sure they have significant notice in order to do that. For certain elements, there are hearing requirements. So in order to pass your budget, you do have to hold a public hearing so that citizens can comment on that. Not every public meeting necessarily is a public hearing. So you can have a public meeting where decisions are made, but you do not you're not forced to hear from the public unless it is also a public hearing. You can choose to hear from the public if you haven't noticed it as a hearing, but rather as just a meeting. And then there are also certain recording requirements. This isn't just the actual audio recording, which is a requirement. You also have to take minutes that describe the actions taken and who voted and etc. So this is in Title 52, Chapter 4 of the Utah Code. It defines a meeting as being a convening of a public body when a quorum is present. So if 2 council members meet in the grocery store, that is not a quorum. If 3, and you have a 5 council member form of government, that would be a quorum, but a chance meeting is also excluded from the definition of a public meeting. It doesn't matter if you're doing it electronically or in person. People can, most cities and towns have their own policies. We've made our own policy of how members can participate, but according to the state, there's nothing that bars them from participating via phone or electronically. You can close a public meeting, and the reasons you can close a public meeting are extremely narrow. You can see those listed out here. It's typically revolving around management and HR issues because you're discussing the character or professional competence, physical and mental health of one individual, not just saying, oh, the finance department is crazy. You can't go into a closed meeting for that. Strategies on collective bargaining, anything that is kind of a true business reason, by reasonable or imminent litigation, buying land, selling land, etc. These are the very narrow definitions of when you can actually close a public meeting. And I saw a question.
So your closed meetings are meant to become public at some point, correct?
Not necessarily. So you can record a public meeting, or you can record the closed portion of a public meeting. You can also have your council sign an affidavit that says, we close this meeting for this specific reason. A reason for that may be if I'm trying to think of, let's say you wouldn't want a recording because you're talking about hiring a city manager, and one person on the council has a lot to say about their professional competence or physical or mental health. That person ends up getting hired, goes back and can hear what one particular person had to say while hiring them. So we've done both at the league when we've closed our meetings. We've signed just the affidavit. We've also kept the recording. But once you have that recording, you don't have to post that. There's not a certain amount of time that goes by where you have to post that. However, that file would be, that audio file would be, could be found in the process of discovery if there was a litigation. So it would be protected under grandma, which we'll get into a little more now, but it would be discoverable in a court of law. Yeah.
Sometimes when we discuss salaries of the employees and they're sitting there, that's a little bit difficult to speak your mind. Mm-hmm. Is there a time and a place when they shouldn't be there and the council should be able to talk among themselves? Just discussing a salary amount, I don't think hits this narrow definition of closing a public meeting. If it happens to be in conjunction with, I mean, you'd really have to be talking about their character or professional competence, not just what you want to pay them. And yeah, there are some of these awkward situations that arise by doing the public's business in public. Another question?
If you're going to, if you're considering closing a meeting, you put this on your agenda, do you have to specify which ones or ones you can discuss and maybe this why? On
your agenda? You wouldn't have to, you would say you're closing under this portion of the code, and then as you went in to it, in the minutes, it would reflect what specific reason you did that. We always put on our agendas, just to be safe, at the bottom, closed session if needed under this part of state code. And that way the public knows. Yeah?
Doing that, doesn't that make the public a little complacent? If they see that on the agenda every single time, they don't think anything of it. They don't know that you're actually, when you actually are going into a closed session.
Yeah, so the minutes and the recording and everything, or if they're in the actual city hall, they would be aware of it then. But I mean, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes something comes up in a meeting, you don't know if you're going to close it, and we just think it's a little better transparency and public policy wise to let people know that there is a possibility that something could close rather than to spring it on them.
You don't have to notice. So what you're saying is, if you even think you might want to go to close session, you just notice it and we can do it. We were always thought we had to give the reasons why we were going to go to closed session.
On your agenda? I don't believe you have to lay the exact, I mean, that's a good practice if you're planning on it and going forward. There's no reason to hide the ball. But if you can you can say you're closing a session based on this section of code, and then in your minutes have it reflect exactly why. You do have to say exactly why you're going into closed session, but that's not a part of the agenda requirement.
I guess my concern with this transparency issue, and it's kind of been brought up a little bit, if you're trying to be transparent, if you're putting in there a potential closed meeting, then you don't really know why you're having a closed meeting, other than yeah, we might just have one. It seems a little untransparent. Generally, we've been caught on this before. I don't know if that's the right word, but we don't know unless we know we're going to have a closed meeting, and then we put why we're having a closed meeting in that. For 2 reasons. We feel it's very transparent to the resident or the taxpayer to see why we're going to have a closed meeting, because if they want to discuss it, they then have the opportunity in the comments section to discuss what we could possibly be talking about. We've done it the other way before in the past, and it just seems like we've been caught on that a few times of all of a sudden pulling a closed meeting over discussing the character of a person or something. When really, and realistically, we could have done it a week later, you know, or we could have done it.
Sure.
It didn't happen.
Sure. I think the more you know going into it, putting the reason on there that is good, transparent policy. The more that you can let them know, but still being able to protect privacy issues that are most of the reasons for closing a meeting, I think that's a really good policy to follow.
Just to the point of putting it on, if you are going to do it on the agenda, you can list what state code allows it for, but then we state why we're going. So if it's for litigation or for land purchase, we state in the minutes or on the record why we're going into closed session, and then we record the closed session except for when we're talking to personnel. And that's the only time we turn it off. And that's in case anybody wants to challenge it, and then the judge or whoever could listen to what was discussed to make sure we stayed on the topic that we went to closed session.
Right. And if you don't record it and you do an affidavit, you are legally signing that you are saying we are discussing only this. So this is pretty much why you want to do the public's business in public. All those in favor of what we discussed in our email thread and at Larry's son's birthday party, say aye. I have no idea what's going on. You're not allowed to make public policy not in the public. Like I said, you can't email back and forth. You can't have side conversations that you'll sometimes see people texting. That is all not what you're supposed to be doing. You have to not only do you make the decisions in public, you also have to deliberate in public. So you can't have all of the discussion and deliberation happening behind closed doors, and then everyone just comes out and gives their decision. And like I said, Dave Church has a session after this. He knows all there is to know about Open and Public Meetings Act. He'll go into that in depth. And any specific questions, you can always give him a call. He's our general counsel. The requirements for public notice, you have to do it 24 hours in advance, and you have to publish it to the public notice website, and that is for all entities. Like I said, the audio recording that you have to keep has to be made 3 days, or has to be made available 3 days, business days after the meeting is held. And then the minutes must be kept, and those draft minutes have to be available to the public as soon as they're available to the council. The council doesn't get to look over those for weeks and weeks, and then you put your draft minutes out right before you approve them. So where does transparency go from there, from the Open and Public Meetings Act? Well, to grandma, of course. This is not my grandma. It was just the cutest grandma I could find on the internet when I was putting together this presentation. So everyone loves a sweet old grandma. How long does the city have to fulfill a grandma request for a document that the city failed to produce but was required by law to do so? So if you were required to produce a document, the city failed to produce a document, you get a grandma request for that. How many days does the city have? 30 days, 10 days, 5 days if it's an expedited request, or none. You don't have to. You don't have to. You're in trouble because you didn't produce a document you were legally supposed to, but you cannot produce a document that you don't have. So under a grandma request, if no record was created, you would not, you'd say, no, we failed in this portion of the law, we cannot produce this document. You couldn't go back and make it out of thin air. So you're still violating the law by not producing a document you were required to produce, but you can't produce what's not there. So that's my trick question in here. So Title 63G, Chapter 2 of Utah Code, that's where grandma exists, defines what a record is and establishes the criteria for gaining access to those records. A public record is any record that is not private, controlled, or protected, and is prepared, owned, received, or retained by the governmental entity. So that means an email that was sent to a governmental entity, you still have to maintain that, and if someone were to grandma that particular email, you would have to produce that as well. That is very specific records are deemed private, controlled, or protected. A lot like the same balancing test that you see with the Open and Public Meetings Act of what can be protected is also in grandma. So a lot of it has to do with public interest versus personal privacy. Federal regulations like HIPAA, Freedom, FERPA, et cetera, make it so there are certain things that can't just be shared with everyone in the general public that a government may be maintaining or controlling. Typically, you have a response time of 10 days. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to produce the document in 10 days. You should, especially if you can, but you do have to respond. So your response to the grandma request can be, we don't have this record, that's not something we keep, this is a protected record, and you can submit to them that you're denying that record's request. But you have to let them know whether or not you're denying it, or whether or not you will be getting it to them within 10 business days. 5 business days, if it's an expedited response is requested, you can also deny expediting it. Typically, who's received an expedited grandma request before? Yeah, there are not many media outlets that want to wait any longer than they have to. So basically, if a media outlet sends a grandma request to you, you will have an expedited request and you will have a fee waiver request as well. You are allowed to charge for what it costs you to produce this, to go back and find the document, to make copies, for a hard drive if they have to be on there. You're allowed to charge for those things. You are only allowed to charge the hourly rate of the lowest paid employee that could produce this document, if you're putting that on your schedule as well. And you should have a fee schedule already set in stone, so people are already in your policies, so that people don't think they're being treated prejudicially because of their particular request. You don't have to keep everything forever. Some things you do. Others you're allowed to and should destroy after a certain amount of time. You're allowed to set your own retention schedules for how long you keep most of the records, except for a few requirements like minutes and agendas you have to have forever. But without your own retention schedule, you default to the State Records Committee schedule. Does anyone have retention schedules that are significantly different from the State Records Committee schedule? Okay, that's a good policy, just to kind of keep it in line with theirs. Yeah?
I have a question on grandma. So I have work in a business, and sometimes I'll do emails for city stuff for my business. How vulnerable I am to get the grandma request on that? So, whether it's on a personal email, a personal computer, a personal phone, it's the content that really what makes it a public record. So if it's a business email and you're talking about how you're going to vote in a city council meeting, that's still a public record. The law does not care whether or not the email server is owned by a city or a public entity. It's whether the public business is being done with that record. Okay, and from grandma, where does transparency go? Every city manager and finance director's favorite site on the planet is the Utah Public Finance website. This was made by the Transparency in Government Act, and you have to actively publish your financial information, transactions, quarterly, to where people can just access that online.
What are the penalties if you don't fulfill grandma?
There are no penalties. There is not teeth to it, other than, I mean, elections are typically a pretty good penalty if someone were to do that. The state auditor can also audit you and have a list of findings, and depending on other financial issues that are going on in that audit, the state auditor can freeze your funds, state funds.
Two things. One was the grandma request itself. A lot of times you'll see a grandma request come in and say, we want to see all of his emails for the past 6 months. And obviously that's not he or she. You've got to be pretty specific what you ask for.
Yeah.
And the second was the assistance from the state. The state actually had a lead from the ombudsman, or
the ombudsman?
Ombudsman, they will kind of assist or help you with some things too. I know when I was mayor, I had a request come in that we couldn't get from one of our council members, and we actually had to get, they actually had to get them involved, come in and help us try to find it and get it out.
Yeah. Yep. And just a couple, before I move on back to the finance website, a couple more things with grandma. Like you said, it does have to be specific, and you can deny a grandma request on it being too broad. A part of this too is you want to have a good working relationship with your general public and also with media outlets that you're constantly going to be working with. So we got a request for any and all emails to or from or pertaining to the media. Now, I get a daily Deseret News email that comes into my thing. That is an email dealing with the media to and from. So we explained that to them, said this is very, very broad. Is there something more specific you're going for? So we told them, how about these search terms going through our emails, and we can get those to you. And they were fine with that because that can be pretty onerous. When you do, and also if you do deny a grandma request, they have a right to appeal that with the State Records Committee. And then it will go to the State Records Committee where they decide whether or not this is a legitimate grandma request and whether or not you have to fulfill it. And they can tell you to fulfill it.
Any advice on if you've got individuals that a grandma request is submitted, like the whole council, and you have some individuals who, because they choose to put things on their own personal computers and stuff, and you know they've got stuff, but they're not willing to produce it, and how to handle that? I mean, what's the...
If they're not willing to produce it, it sounds like the only way is really to go to the state and have someone hired do that. One thing is to tell your elected officials, and if you are elected officials, try and keep all your stuff separate. I know that's never always possible. You can have citizens who know your work email emailing you, and that would still be a government record. The person who is going to go in, or at least the person who's in charge, depending on the size of your organization, it might not be this exact person, but the person who has access to this and actually starts fulfilling this is your records officer in your organization. So they would have access to your private email to find public documents in there, public records in there. That does not mean that the Deseret News gets access to your entire Gmail account. So that's just one thing to know, that your records officer, and they have there are HR requirements and best practices of keeping things private, even though they're looking around in your personal email. Okay, so here's a quiz. Entities with a budget less than what do not have to upload to the Utah Public Finance website? How many people think if you're under $1 million, you don't have to do it? $500,000? $250,000? Everybody has to do it. Everybody has to do it. And this is all public entities, not just cities and towns. Only recently were interlocals, which is what the Utah League of Cities and Towns is, included in this definition as well. I think 2013 was the first year that we were required to do that. And this is where you have to upload all your financial information, all your transactions. Has anyone ever uploaded this stuff before? It's a real fun spreadsheet. Where you have to put it in their form, upload it into this weird file type, and then get it onto the site. And that way the public can access that all the time. Like I said, regardless of size, you have to do that, and you have to do it quarterly. Now, the tough part with every transaction being quarterly, because before I was doing most of the research with the league, You've heard crap in, crap out. Well, if these are unaudited numbers, when you're trying to use them for research purposes and they haven't gone through, been audited before, they're not going to match up with what your final audited financial statements necessarily are at the end of the year. And for a nerdy numbers person, it makes things a little difficult. So like I said, this was created by the Transparency in Government Act. That is in Title 63A, Chapter 3 in Utah Code. I think we pretty much went over all this. Absolutely everyone has to upload it. But we only started doing that after, I think just before our legislative audit that some of you may have heard of. I worked very closely with Daryl Swenson, who's the transparency coordinator at the Division of Finance, and he's the go-to guy if you have any questions about how to get doing this if you're not already. But you should have, if you haven't been doing it already, you'd be getting a postcard saying that you're not, and that your funds could be withheld by the auditor. But yeah, Daryl Swenson at the Division of Finance, go-to guy on this. Now, who enforces all of this? That is the Office of the Utah State Auditor. And this is the least threatening photo I could find of our wonderful auditor. He looks very approachable and friendly here. And I wanted to include that because we worked with him very closely after our state audit to make sure we were getting back in compliance. A lot of people are afraid of the state auditor, think he's just trying to do gotcha questions with people, but he's actually very helpful and wants to make sure people are above board, are following through all the transparency requirements. So Jeremy Walker is the local government guy in his office, if any of you have worked with him before, but don't be afraid to talk to the auditor. However, he is in charge of enforcement if you're not following these rules. He can freeze your state funds. And he can freeze any funds that are coming to you from the state, and depending on what types of financial misconduct they may occur, he can freeze the entire bank account so you can't even access money anymore. And that has happened in a couple special service districts, small special service districts in the state. You have to submit your yearly audited financial statements to him. You have to submit the official budget to the auditor's office, and they keep a record of all of that online that the public can access. Like I said, he can audit you, which is really fun. We'll talk about that a little more. But he can freeze your funds and make sure you're not getting anything until you get back on board. They also offer a lot of training. They also do symposiums with local government officials to figure out, here's what we're thinking of imposing on local governments this year. What is your take on it? How does this work? They work with the finance professionals in the cities and towns and throughout the state. And they really wanted to get across that this is a partnership between state and local government. He isn't the big bad wolf. So let's talk about technology and how it affects transparency. Like I said earlier in this session, the better technology gets, the more people expect of you. Now, this guy right here is holding a 128 gigabyte flash drive and 132 megs worth of floppy disks. You can just see the size difference there. And people still remember floppy disks? How about the actual floppy ones? Yeah. I barely do, but I remember them. I saw a really funny thing that had a yellow floppy disk. Someone had written on it, "Why is this Post-it note so hard?" Because people had never seen the floppy disk before. Moore's Law, so has anyone heard of Moore's Law before? Yeah, it's basically the idea that processing power grows at an exponential rate as size decreases. So that is basically what you're looking at right there. So our phones are getting faster, more able to do everything, and people are streaming is faster, internet's faster, everything's growing at an exponential rate, and people do expect more when they can FaceTime live with someone. They don't really buy it anymore that you don't want to have any sort of streaming of your council meetings. How many people do stream their council meetings? Live stream? What types of things do you use for that? I know there's like YouTube, Facebook Live I've seen, some really sophisticated programs.
Cell phone, Facebook Live.
Yep, it's that simple.
Everybody gets a notification.
Yep.
The first time we did it, we decided 5 minutes before the meeting, let's go ahead and do it live. Had 100-something people watching.
Wow.
And we normally get about 3 people at
Yeah. Yep. So that lets people engage without actually having to come down to City Hall, keeps them in the know. Now, there was a bill a couple years ago that we jokingly called HB blank because it actually never got a number. But they were going to require all cities and towns in the state, regardless of size, to live stream their meetings. There are places in the state that don't have broadband internet, where that would just essentially be impossible. And there are communities of certain sizes where investing in sophisticated materials, which is what most people were using then, as opposed to Facebook Live or YouTube Live, that was just cost prohibitive. We went out to the Clerks and Recorders Association, polled their membership to see how many people were doing it, how many people could do it, and we got the League Army activated and went to the sponsor and said, this is just a no-go, there's no way this is even going to be possible, and he withdrew the bill, never even got a number. So we defeated HB blank. So with technology moving, where does transparency end? Well, it never ends. And I don't know if any of you recognize this as the never-ending story, because that's what transparency is. The increased capabilities that will only keep coming and be better and better are only going to make people demand more. I wouldn't be surprised if, even though a couple years ago it would be virtually impossible to live stream meetings, I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes a requirement in the future. 15 years, I mean, we probably won't even have city halls or something. We'll be flying around and just streaming each other all the time. But it never ends. You will have to get on board with this just by the virtue of how fast technology moves and what people demand. And there's local innovation as well. It's really great. We love telling the state this because we don't only do things just because the state forces us to. We are engaging in local innovation with transparency. People are posting more on their website. People are live streaming their meetings even though they're not required to. We, as public officials, we want to be more engaged with our citizens and more transparent. So any other ideas that you think that's something unique that maybe your city or town is doing that's kind of innovative in the realm of transparency? Live streaming's a great one, just putting everything on your website. But I've yet to hear some just kind of, I don't know, some crazy ideas that we might get to pass around. Okay. Yeah.
For you, do you think they'll have, the state will ever pass a law where our financial statements for cities will be audited? You'll have to come up with more stringent auditing requirements for the cities financially. Because the audit statement that we have to present once a year really not stringently requirement. The audit requirements are not really stringent. What they get from the auditors that we hire.
I would never put it past the state of passing any law that makes it harder for us to do things. So.
They really, when the audit statement comes through, they sign a disclaimer, and it's really, they're really not like a normal CPA firm. When they audit, when they pass the thing that goes out to shareholders, major corporations, they really, they're stating their reputation on the line on a major corporation. It goes out to shareholders. One that goes out to the citizens that they present to the citizens is just like, okay, it's okay. That's basically all they're saying.
Certainly. I wouldn't be surprised if any of that would be tightened up at some point, but a lot of what's included in the requirements for those annual audits required, the financial audit required by the state auditor's office, are based on nationwide professional guidelines. So I think there is a larger kind of a larger regime working on this where we wouldn't just take off in one complete different direction because it is based on a lot of like Gatsby requirements and whatnot.
Yeah, they meet Gatsby.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so then that way you're trying to do transparency that way. You're going live streaming everything. that way you keep the public aware, okay, we spent this much, and
Yeah. Yep, and anyone can go on the financial transparency website and do a little of their own digging if they want. But I wouldn't be surprised if eventually something became a little more stringent. But that's also when they put together what's required on the annual audit, they send out a notice every year. They meet with local government representatives if they're going to add anything new or take anything away or that. So there's multiple levels from the higher national level, the state level, and then local input as well that decides what's included in those. Yeah.
Tell us briefly how texting is with the grammar request.
A text is, it's, if you're, I'm trying to think exactly how to answer this. If you're talking about a public matter, that is whether it's your personal phone or not, that is a record. They would have to go to the phone company to access those, but it's communication. It's any record produced. Now, did the state succeed in exempting themselves? Does anyone? I believe legislators exempted themselves from that requirement, or I know they tried to, and there was a bit of an uproar. But like in many things, the state, doesn't really care if you guys have to follow the rules as long as they don't. So, a text is a communication.
In a closed meeting, who can you invite in? Who can you kick out? And who takes control of the director of the district, you don't want in that meeting, can the chairman of the board kick that director out?
Absolutely.
Kick out members of the board? What minimum amount of people you have?
You would not be able to force a voting member of the body out. An employee, general public, those sorts of things you could. But you wouldn't say, all right, I've got these 3 votes. We're going to kick the other 2 out, that sort of deal. No. But no, you don't have to. A city manager or an executive director or anything like that does not have to be invited. Now, we've always had, when we've held a closed meeting, we have our voting board members and then also our general counsel there as well, just to make sure that we're following all the rules. Yeah?
Not a question, but a comment. For 30 years, I worked as a political investigative reporter for the Standard Examiner, and a lot of that involved going to public meetings. And I've got to say, transparency over those 30 years did get better. But I want you to know that none of you have ever really lived until you've been thrown out of a public meeting and knowing you were absolutely right and had every right to be there. And so I wanted to make that comment because I think we're moving in the direction we need to, if that makes sense, based on what I encountered.
Yeah. Yeah, and whether it's a lot of it is we're moving willingly. I think it's just kind of a good sense of our democracy, but at the same time, it is a lot of these demands that citizens have now with technology. If you had to go down, request an actual piece of paper, sit there and make copies of it yourself, versus you can just go to their website and look it on, you feel more entitled to your right to access that document, and you're more apt to do it. So I do think that has certainly pushed us in that direction, because there just isn't really an option to not anymore. The old excuses of it takes too much time or it's too burdensome, those are going away as technology gets better. So it looks like we're running out of time, but very briefly, I just want to go through the league story. You can see a big red non-compliance sticker there. For years and years, how many people actually knew that the Utah League of Cities and Towns is a public entity? How many people thought it might be a nonprofit of some sort? Yeah, a lot of people, where we kind of landed, no one really knew. We've been a governmental entity since the 80s, before we were set up as a nonprofit. So we're an interlocal entity, and we're required to follow all the rules that a public entity would. We were not. We never really closed our meetings off, but we did not notice them. So they were not really public and open and public meetings. We'd never had budget hearings before. Those were always just a regular board meeting. We never recorded anything. We did take minutes, but we never had an audio recording of anything. We were not uploading to the financial website, even though we were required to starting in 2013. And in grandma, we were somewhat compliant. We just never really got any grandma requests until we were in the news. And that is when we actually started to deal with that and make sure our records retention was correct and that we were getting the materials to the media that they required. So bad, complete non-compliance. But now we've cleaned everything up. We've updated our policies, so there's a clear delineation of who does what. So we're making sure that these are being posted to the public notice website, minutes are getting up, audio's getting up in time, that we are posting our meetings. We worked with the actual state agencies whose rules at the time we were not complying with to make sure we were up to date. And that includes the state auditor, like I was saying, after our big audit, and the Division of Finance, who really came in and showed us exactly how we were supposed to do it. And there was just an overall change in the culture of our organization that has a larger emphasis on transparency and accountability. We're holding this workshop. We're working with public entities. We want to set an example of what you all should be doing in your entities as well. All right, well, thank you very much for coming. Stay transparent.